And good evening. Welcome to Raconteurs News on a Tuesday. It's the 26th of January 2021, and the madness around us continues. Just before we start, I'd just like to say it came up the StreamYard year that we'd paid for, that I'd got donations for last year. But that was up this year, this month, and they kept trying to take money out of my account, and then finally they did. So they took 181 quid. Now I've had half of that given to me, donated already by a listener. And I'm just looking, it's just another 90 quid that I need to raise, just to make sure that I'm not completely out of pocket. So if anybody wants to donate, I will put a banner across the bottom at some point. If you want to donate, it's just, it took all my spaz money, and we got nothing. So I just wanted to, just wondered if anybody wants to donate. I'll put the donation, it's by PayPal, or if you want to contact me, if you want to donate in another way. But anyway, thank you for joining us this evening. The Dalai Lama, Kerry Duff, Heath's there as well. Evening, Heath. I didn't get that signal one, or whatever thing you sent me. I didn't bother with it because I heard that it weren't very good. So I've still been sending you stuff on WhatsApp. But I think there's another one that's they're all infiltrated. They're all going to be able to see anyway on what's going on. Matthew and Donna Caddy, I'm assuming, are both listening. Good evening to you. And of course, Super Leeds, our number one fan and the number one in the world. A decent, good, top geezer. So anyway, tonight, what have we got for you? Well, we've got for you, if you remember back in the days, if you're a listener, from right back in the days, and I'm talking the first year we started, but we used to have this guy on from the Sirius report, Paul. We called him our financial guy, our insider, financial insider. But we also had some great conversations about geopolitics as well. And we were the ones, I remember us talking about a world where this were obviously pre-Donald Trump, but we would have a world where Donald Trump and Boris Johnson were running it. Two of the biggest economies. So that seems to have worked out. So I saw him online a couple of days ago, and I thought, it'd be great to get him back. So good evening to you, Paul. How are you doing, my friend?
Yes, good evening, Jason. Yeah, I'm very well, and obviously good evening to everyone who's listening. Yeah, how are you?
I'm good. I'm all right. At the top, if you can, you see the comments?
Hang on.
At the top, there should be something that says comments, something that says private and comments. So if you hit the comments one, you'll be able to see the comments that are coming in through the.
Right. Hang on. No, I can. Where am I supposed? Where am I looking?
I think it's up towards top and right. Something will say private chat, and then something will say comments.
There's a thing, chat, private chat. Oh, hang on, comments.
Comments, right? You click on the comments.
Oh yes, yeah, I've got that now. Yeah.
There you go. That's it. We got
Right.
that sorted out. So you can see all the comments that are coming in, and any questions that might be in there. Yeah, we're all good. It's great to talk to you again. I mean, we spoke on phone the other day, and you've got plenty to say. So where do you want to start with this? You spoke about what you wanted to start with beforehand. So shall we keep up?
Yeah, I think there's an important distinction we need to make. I think everybody's in pretty broad agreement that the mainstream media is an enormous thorn in our side, to put it diplomatically. But I still have kind of some concerns with regards to how people who look for alternative media sources, because they don't trust the mainstream media, but they still tend to embrace mainstream media thoughts in the context of the alt media. And if we look historically, a great example was we all got told about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which of course was a complete lie. And history's proven that quite clearly. But the issue I have is that most people, and everybody who listens here and listens in a large number of other places, has rightly a complete distrust of their government. They don't trust them. They don't believe in them. They don't trust anything they say. But we seem to have this fundamental problem where we don't trust anything they say until they tell us something concerning Iraq, Iran, and China, Russia, North Korea. And then all of a sudden we completely believe everything they're telling us. And yet my attitude to that is, well, if you distrust them about things they tell you within your own country, why would you necessarily trust them when they tell you things regarding those nations? Now, when we look at, with respect to the mainstream media, there's some classic psychological tactics they employ, which is they want to stir people's emotions. They want to put you into a state of heightened emotion. So when you see something, you'll react in a way they'd like you to react to it. Now, more often than not, that's a negative sort of context with respect to something. They want to drive fear into people, or they want to make them believe an aspect which could be, let's say, Iran's a great example, or China and Russia. So that's a tactic they employ. Now, my concern with regards to the alt media is there's people in the alt media who do precisely the same thing. And we've got some great examples of that, where they drive people into this heightened sense of euphoria, the whole Q movement, which was proved to, of course, never have any substance. And I, for the last 3 years, have said on many occasions elsewhere, there's no reality to it. So there's that side. Then there's the alt media side that drives people into abject fear. So they tell you everything in the future is this dystopian world, this hideous technocracy, and how we're all doomed, and the world's going to be this awful place controlled by a one world government, etc., which of course is not reality either. But why do they do this? Because, okay, some people genuinely believe this to be true. I don't dispute that. But there is an element who do this because when you drive people into a euphoria, or you drive people into abject fear, you have a captive audience. You keep that audience because they keep coming back going, well, I want to hear more about this. Tell me more about it. And that captive audience from the Q movement was a great example. Millions of people bought into it. And yet here we are, Biden's now the president, and they're still trying to, some people insist that Biden is the president, when if Biden isn't the president and Trump somehow is. And they're trying to spin all ideas that in fact, in reality, this is what's happening. And therefore, consequently, people still out there believe this because they want to continue to believe in this, because they're being driven into this heightened sense of euphoria, even though, if we think about it, there's not any reality to it. And also the flip side is, yes, the world's a far from perfect place. Yes, there are nefarious people and elements. We've known this throughout history of things that have gone on. No one's disputing that. But that's a world away from this idea that everything's a dystopian future. Everything, whatever's going to happen, it's this hideous outcome with respect to how the world's unfolding. And there's this global elite who control the world, which they don't. There's a one world government in the making, or it exists, which it doesn't. And that's the important distinction. And I think it's important to say this because these views shape how we understand things. So people's immediate reaction is, well, and we can talk about the whole pandemic thing. I'm not going to get into the specifics about the virus or anything, just people's perception when the pandemic came out, how people reacted to that. And they reacted to that on the basis a lot of the time through these preconceived ideas that there's a dystopian future. And also one of the fundamental issues why people think this is because they're conditioned to believe there's this all, encompassing empire that exists, and it will always be in charge. It will always be in control. So if this empire looks like it's collapsing, well, therefore that means it can't be collapsing. So therefore they must be deliberately collapsing it. Even though when we look back since 2008, they've done everything to prevent its collapse. So why would they suddenly want to collapse it? It makes no sense, because the reason they've tried to stop collapsing it is because once it's collapsed, and I said this probably, I think when we first did it, 2016 maybe, I said back then that this empire in the West was collapsing, and it is. It's not going to be replaced by some dystopian future, because the reason it's collapsing is because the world's rejecting it. And then when the world rejects it, the world's not going to suddenly embrace the empire that it's rejected. And because someone comes up with a new idea as to how the world should operate, it simply isn't going to work that way. So these are important distinctions, because I'm very mindful things do exist. And I use this thing, there are many conspiracies that are absolutely proven, but there are many conspiracy theories that have no basis in reality. And we need to importantly distinguish between the two.
So when people are talking about this one world government, you don't think that that's actually something that's going to come into effect? We're not going to be governed by one. The whole world's not going to be governed by one group. You don't think that exists at the moment, or that there are plans for that to happen?
No, absolutely not. And here's the kind of reason and rationale behind why I say that. If you look at the Western world currently, what is the one thing it's constantly hammering at us 24/7? It's constantly trying to demonize China, Russia, Iran. The reason it's demonizing those nations is because they, along with most of the world now, refuse to acquiesce to the Western financial system, the dollar. They refuse to be subordinate to it. They're trying to effectively, and failing. I mean, the US tried a trade war with China that failed. They tried to crush them economically. They tried to destroy Huawei and the technological base. So they're doing this because they are posing a direct threat to the Western Empire, which is not a global governance structure. The world as China, Russia, and Southeast Asia and the multipolar world as it exists is a direct challenge. And the nations that pose the biggest threat to the Western Empire, which is collapsing anyway, is the multipolar world. So that's why they want to demonize these nations, because they don't want Southeast Asia and the African nations and South America and Europe to join the multipolar world because it weakens their empire to the point it collapses. But what's caused the dollar to be so weak is because the world's rejecting it. The world's joining this new world, this multipolar world, and they're embracing this ideal that we don't want to be subordinate to the West. We don't want to be subordinate to the dollar and you two impose sanctions and regime change and war. We're moving away from that. So no, there was never a one world government ever under consideration. That's just an alt media story that has become so ingrained that people believe it to be true. But you don't have to look. If there was one world governance, you wouldn't have the US trying to destroy other nations all the time. And the reason they're destroying it is because they all rejected the dollar. It's why Saddam Hussein wasn't a problem until they removed him, because he rejected the dollar. Gaddafi. It's why it's why they always try to implement regime change anywhere, because you defy America. Well, too much of the world defies them now, and the Western Empire. So therefore, and historically, empires never survive anyway. But because people are conditioned to believe this empire will exist forever, because it can't possibly disappear. Well, if it's collapsing, as I said, therefore it must be deliberate. They must be collapsing it. But as I said, they've done the exact reverse for 12 years, because once the dollar-centric world's gone, it's gone forever. You can't magically collapse it all and then which the world's rejected and then turn around to the world and say, you're having a new dollar system. Because the world's already going, hang on, we've moved on from this. And I've said this, 4 or 5 years ago, that all the things that I said then are what's unfolding now, because this isn't a recent kind of phenomenon. It's been, ironically, this may surprise people, but the West's been collapsing for decades. And because empires collapse very slowly and empires rise, but the big difference is the West is now trying to convince the rest of the world that this new empire is going to do all the things we did to you, but they pretend they didn't do to us. So they're trying to subjugate you. They're trying to control you. They're trying to economically impoverish you. They're trying to put you into debt traps. All the things that the IMF's done, the World Bank's done, Western nations have done to the rest of the world. They're now trying to convince the world that's what China's doing, and by extension, the multipolar world's been subject to that. And look at what Pompeo did for 2 years. He's just been on this massive PR offensive around the world, trying to convince everyone that China's this evil empire that wants to control the world, and the world's ignoring it. And that's why everyone's signing trade deals with China, and because they know the reality. But that's the other thing. The alt media now has joined the bandwagon and is now trying to say, well, China's part of the Great Reset. China's part of the Davos. China's trying to do all these hideous things and turn the world into a technocracy. Well, who started those ideas? It was this like kind of deep state in America were the ones who fermented that idea in people's conscious that that's what they were trying to do. Well, again, that's another example where the alt media has picked up on what the mainstream media is saying, and the Western deep state, operatives, for want of a better word, who are saying all the same thing, and they bought into this and go, well, that must be true. So why are they buying the same narrative that the mainstream media is putting out and not asking, well, actually, is this a reality? And whether people want to accept it or not, that's not how the rest of the world perceives China. And whether we agree with it, disagree, doesn't matter. The rest of the world's moving on, and the last remnants of what you could call an empire, which is failing rapidly, is mainly the UK, the United States, maybe to some extent Australia, Canada, and partially New Zealand. But look at Europe. It's recently signed an enormous investment trade deal with China because it says this is the future. The future it doesn't belong with the Western Empire anymore. We know it's failing. We know we have to move. So this idea, this one world governance, as people perceive, it's just a couple of nations who are rapidly becoming irrelevant on the world stage, and it's nothing more than that. The other important thing is maybe we should discuss what is this, cabal, deep state as people perceive it? Because I view that possibly very differently to a lot of other people.
So how would you, I mean, most people would say Rothschilds, big banks, Rockefellers, all the usual, the 13 families, as AD, God bless him, it says used to say all the time, talk about the 13 families. What's your take on it?
Well, there was a point there's no doubt there was a point in history where the Rothschilds had enormous influence, the Rockefellers had enormous influence, but the world's moved on. That's not the way it is anymore. Here's what fundamentally drives American policy decision is right, the military-industrial complex, everyone knows what that is. That drives US foreign policy because they want wars. Why do they want wars? Because they sell arms to other nations. They want to convince Japan, say in South Korea, that China's a threat. Why? So they can put bases there. Why? So they can sell lots of arms to them. They've got no intention of going to war with China because mutual self-destruction isn't really what they want. It's the same with Russia. Convince Europe that Russia's a threat. You can push NATO onto the borders of Russia. Why? Because you sell them lots of arms and weapons and make them believe, like particularly the Baltic states, the former Soviet republics, that they're in imminent danger of a Russian invasion. That again is just propaganda to justify also, the US military budget of $750 billion a year. I think it was Jack Ma summed it up perfectly when he said to the American people, why aren't you complaining that they haven't spent trillions of dollars on you, the American people, instead of on pointless wars trying to blow up the world? And that in reality is exactly the problem, but it's a conditioning. It's also a justification why, if commercial interests, such as they wanted to put energy pipelines through Syria, so they went, well, Assad doesn't want that, so let's start a war to remove it. It's like, let's get rid of Maduro in Venezuela for the same reason, because he's not playing ball with us. He wants to trade in non-dollar terms. He wants to trade with Iran. And so the list goes on and on. So it's primarily, it functions around, yes, there's the banking system, but we'll come to that shortly. There's all the big corporations. There's obviously, as we said, the military-industrial complex. That is largely what drives policy, because if you think about it, all of the Congress, or a lot of the Congress, are in the back pockets of big corporations. Big corporations make sure these people get elected. Yeah. And therefore, they'll do the bidding of big corporations. So if big corporations want a certain industry somewhere in a certain state, they'll just lobby the person they got into office and make sure it happens. So that largely drives domestic policy. International policy is the military-industrial complex. But here's the interesting point. Everyone focuses on the Federal Reserve. And like the Federal Reserve is the root of all evil. The Federal Reserve's actually just a conduit. It's a conduit for what's called the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is ultimately a function of the US Treasury, which is the government. That tells the Federal Reserve what to do. And they actually had to let that slip slightly. I think it was a couple of years ago when they actually started to have to admit, no, it was actually since the pandemic, that the US Treasury was almost telling the Federal Reserve what to do. Suddenly they couldn't blur that distinction anymore. It was too obvious that there was this cooperation between these, apparently, because the central bank's supposed to be independent, which of course it isn't. And then the banks themselves, the banks are just conduits once again. They'll do the bidding of big corporations. They'll launder money for all nefarious businesses. I mean, how much drugs money have we seen banks being accused of laundering? And they launder money for all manner of what you call disgusting, nefarious activities that is part of this global empire. I mean, the narcotics industry is a great example. It's worth $1 trillion a year. So they're the entities. There isn't look, historically we had the idea of families controlling things, but that's not how it operates anymore. That's a thing that happened at one point in history, but we tend to look back and go, well, this is how it was 100 years ago, but the world changes massively in the last 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years. It's not, we seem to be stuck sometimes believing that nothing's changed. You know, it's a bit like people's view of China is how it was 50 years ago. Well, go to China and you'll see it's nothing like that anymore. So we have these preconceived ideas. So yes, there are there is corporations that operate globally. They definitely want to maximize as much profit as they can, and they'll do it at any expense to the likes of you and I. The military industrial complex does likewise. Banks, of course, fulfill certain conduits, but then they're allowed to speculate, to try and make huge amounts of money, although that's failing now and they can't really make any money anymore because they've cooked their own goose with how the financial system now operates, particularly in the West. So yes, I agree, but this thing's not omnipotent. It doesn't control everything. It doesn't sit there moving chess pieces round the globe trying to instigate all these policies. And that's where this feeds into people's perspective as to what this coronavirus was really all about. But we'll pause and talk about that in a minute. But it's an important distinction between recognizing there are corporations, military industrial complex, banking system that does all these things. But that's a world away from this idea that they control everything, because we've just established they don't control China, they don't control Russia, they don't control Iran, they don't control most of Africa or Southeast Asia anymore. That's why Southeast Asia's recently signed this enormous trade deal with what are called the ASEAN nations, and there was China, New Zealand, South Korea. They're effectively going to work outside the dollar system eventually. Well, that's not part of this empire that people think exists. And these are important distinctions for me that highlight this is the reality. Yes, there are fundamental problems. We're not disputing it, but I try to base, for me, I think this idea of telling people there's this global governance that controls us all is actually just drives people into fear. They think there's no hope, there's no chance of change, but the world's changing. It's just the West isn't the one that's implementing the change, because the West is collapsing. When empires collapse, they don't implement change. They're just thrashing around trying to stay in existence. And we can see what's happening in the world. It's failing, because if the US was a dominant power, it wouldn't spend all its time and energy trying to destabilize China, Russia, Iran, and other nations. It does it because it's weak.
Yeah. We used to speak a lot of the BRICS countries previously. I mean, how are they going on? I did notice that the Brazilian Prime Minister, or who I think it's Prime Minister, had said that the coronavirus were nothing like it was being portrayed as, and there's been no lockdowns or anything over there in Brazil. I mean, he seems to be just completely ignoring him. So can we add Brazil to that list of people that
well, Brazil, the issue with Brazil is it's kind of flip-flopping between embracing the new world and being frightened to distance itself from the United States. Bolsonaro's kind of was more Western sympathetic. I mean, you got to bear in mind he was effectively put in place by the West. So, I mean, the BRICS kind of was a forerunner. Obviously, there's a very close relationship between Russia and China. South Africa's sort of struggling. India's got very strong relations with Russia, but is being basically driven into fear with regards to China. Relations between the two nations aren't exactly great. But the BRICS was kind of a forerunner. I mean, but it's being replaced because you've now got the ASEAN nations. You've got this RCEP agreement. You've got the Eurasian Economic Union. And so these are all big sort of individual trade and commerce and in some cases military alliances that have grown and expanded enormously in the last few years. So yeah, the BRICS it never kind of took off particularly, but it's being consumed by numerous other developments. But the relationship between China and Russia in the time since we've spoken is developed out of all recognition. I mean, it's probably the strongest alliance we've seen in modern history. I mean, and that's the other thing. The US has done everything to try and break it apart, but actually it's pulled it together. And we always said way back when in 2016, the backbone of the future world was Russia and China. We talked about Europe being part of it in the Eurasian axis, but China and Russia were very much part of that. But the other point is, of course, people in the West are thinking, well, I don't like the sound of this. I'm not really very keen on the idea. But the big difference is China's not going to try and run the world like the Americans did, because it knows it will fail. Because everybody thinks that we're going to end up with a surveillance society like China. We're going to end up consumed by this technocracy. All these words keep springing up. But that's not how China is not going to go into the United States and tell the US what to do, because he couldn't do that. As weak as the US is, it's still a major nuclear power. And it's not simply, but what it wants to do is the US to sit there and go, well, okay, we're going to have to just be, an equal partner in the world. And the US will benefit hugely if it does that, but the US mentality always is you're with us or against us. If you're not 100% with us, you're an enemy and we want to destroy you. Well, that's kind of Neanderthal primitive way of thinking, and they need to move on from that. But of course, the problem is the US doesn't want to face its own humiliation of being a former global dominant power, which it has been since World War II. And there's an interesting story about World War II, which we come to at some other point in the future. But yeah, fundamentally, there is just this huge paradigm shift. And I said somewhere else back in March 2018, you are going to see a propaganda offensive against China, which will make the Cold War look like a non-event. And the reason it was obvious what was coming, because the US finally went, because they didn't take China seriously. Suddenly they took them seriously and realized China was all over the world, signing trade deals with every nation literally on the planet. And they went, we can't have this. So that now we'll have to demonize them. That's why they started a trade war, because they saw China as a threat. I mean, think about when Trump first came into office. He rolled out the red carpet for Xi. 12 months later, he was in a trade war with it. Why? Because suddenly the United States took China seriously, and the attitude was, China's a threat to us. If China's a threat, we have to extinguish that threat, even though, of course, they were incapable of doing that.
So where's this idea that the China thing is all Biden? I mean, since he's been elected, all we've got, apart from the Q nonsense that some people are still hanging on to, but all we've got from the, let's just say, people who are that look at shows like this, who look at alt media, all they've got is that Biden's a communist and that he's going to allow China in. I mean, what's all that about? Where did that come from? Well,
let's look back. Let's look back prior to the 2016 election, and this here's the quite amusing thing. Trump got elected, and what did they do? Because bear in mind, all party politics is an illusion just to deceive people. So we had the Democrats going, Trump's in Putin's back pocket. It was all Russiagate, Russia, with regards to Trump. Of course, the whole Russiagate thing was nonsense. They never proved anything. And then what did they do? They went, oh, well, now Trump's gone. Well, we'll flip the narrative and say it's all China. And yeah, of course, he was the vice president at one point, Biden. So yeah, he was seen in Beijing. And then the idea is, well, because, Biden's therefore, he's going to let the Chinese walk in through the back door. Well, here's the reality. When Trump was elected, he was supposed to form a strong relations with China because he knew America was collapsing. He knew the dollar was on its knees, and they had to reformulate relations. Okay, for whatever reason, it didn't happen, but it doesn't matter. We are where we are. So the point is then it became, let's demonize China. So the Trump administration started demonizing it. So the election campaign was to try and convince Americans, don't vote for Biden, okay, whatever the outcome of the election. And there's a lot of theories on that, but let's not worry about that for now. So now it becomes a mantra that Biden's going to let China in and China's going to take control of America. Well, that's just simply impossible. But you see, the problem is, this is where the mainstream media feeds this narrative about China. And we see the alt media grab this narrative and talk about it as and believing this to be reality, but they're just parroting what the mainstream media is. And let's face it, does anyone think Pompeo's has got humanity's best interest at heart? Because he's one of the biggest exponents of telling us that China's this evil empire and he admitted they're trying to, he says, take control of the world, take control of America. But why would we take any notice of what Pompeo said? I mean, he's a big, huge deep state player. But the problem is suddenly everyone believes this. And the rationale behind this is because there are elements within the United States who would rather the United States collapses in a heap rather than actually pick up the phone tomorrow to Beijing and go, okay, the world's changing. We're going to have to, not have Bretton Woods, but some sort of summit and resolve these problems. They don't want that to happen. So what they're now trying to convince all Americans is, well, if Biden picks up the phone and tries to have some sort of normal relations with China, that proves what we're telling you. He's letting China in. I mean, there was all this stuff about China having troops on the border of Mexico and Canada. I mean, these kind of stories are just ridiculous. There's no substance to it. And the idea that once Biden came in, China was going to come in and take control. This is, again, this falls into all this stuff that happened with regards to Q. There's all the stuff with regards to since the election. I mean, how many incredible stories did we hear about what's going to happen after the election in November? There was the CIA invaded, or a CIA headquarters was invaded in Germany, and they took these servers away. Well, that story died a death. All of ballot papers are being watermarked. That never happened. The military are taking control. That never happened. The list goes on. And that's why a lot of these stories that emanate just have no substance to them. So, yeah, the China rhetoric is to keep people in the US thinking, well, China, we have to view them as hostile and as an enemy. Because whereas the United States needs to embrace this new world that's developing and realize without it, it's got huge, enormous problems. So, and yeah, someone makes the comment they're going to announce something soon, and it's always been manana. And here's the thing that got me with regards to the whole Q thing. When it started out, I think it was October 2017, my first thought was, hang on, so we're supposed to believe that there's this plan that's going to take down the deep state, that people view as being omnipotent and all-powerful. They're going to take it down with a plan that they decided to tell the world about on a message board. I mean, immediately you think of that, you go, well, this is rubbish. Because even if there was a plan, the last thing they're going to do is put it on a message board so the deep state can read it and realize something's happening. But think about it. People bought into this, millions of them, and some probably huge amounts still do, were within the first minute of seeing it, you go, hang on, this can't have any basis in reality. But again, that made people very euphoric. They jumped on the back of the Trump bandwagon because Americans thought Trump was the guy who could change everything because he wasn't a politician. And they all sat back and went, well, Trump knows what he's doing. And when Trump started to not do the things he should do, they went, oh, this must be part of the plan. This is what, Trump's in control. Trump knows what he's doing. And then it was, well, he'll do it after the midterms. No, he'll do it during his second term. And here we are. He's out. He's not the president anymore. So that was a way of just driving people to believe that everything was in hand, and no one needs to say anything or do anything, and no one needs to drive Trump to do things and to use that huge support base he had to affect positive change in America. And instead, his administration ended and nothing had changed. Absolutely nothing.
No, you're right. They didn't. I mean, they point to economic stuff, and but that's not draining the swamp, is it? They didn't build a wall. I don't think a single brick's been laid, has it?
Well, they just refurbished certain sections, but I mean, the point is that was just a stunt. That was just a way of I mean, it was no.
It was the change. But Obama had changed, didn't he? And he had build the wall, and it's all it is repetitive and repetitive, so they can chant it. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. Brilliant. Well, it's brilliant marketing, isn't it? Really. I mean, you repeat something and it gets into people's heads.
Well, yeah, and that's exactly the point. That and this is the problem. Yeah, the mainstream media utilizes that tactic extremely well, and we all can see the deficiencies of that. But the problem is, as I said, that I mean, the Q thing. A lot of people embraced it because they believed it to be true. Genuinely. I mean, there's some big players out there who really believed in it, but they never actually sat there and went, well, if this was a reality, why am I being told publicly? I mean, I used a very crude analogy that said it's a bit like during World War II that the Allies actually published their plans in German newspapers and said, don't worry, we've got a plan, but it's secret. I mean, it's just not how it works in the world. The reality is that you wouldn't know anything about it. And of course, it created all this circus, all these, alt media personalities who jumped on the bandwagon. But ultimately, there was no substance to it. And I have to be, I'm not dissing every single, there's plenty of great people in the alt media, don't get me wrong, but there are people that get preconceived ideas as to what's going on. But a lot of these ideas have been doing the rounds for decades. And they may have been true at one point. I mean, it's a bit like saying, China's a great example. The West tried to subvert China to its way of thinking. It tried to, and there was a lot of Western influence in China at one point, absolutely. And they wanted to sort of model China more on the West. And they had some degree of success. Now, so people always go back to that point in history and go, well, that proves China's part of this one world government. Well, no, because look at what China's done since 2000. Look at since Xi Jinping's been the president. Look at how things are changing. It bears no resemblance to 40 years ago. I mean, it's like it's like us saying in the West, if we go back 40 years ago, what we saw then, does it apply to how the world is now? No, because the world's evolving. It's very fluid. Things change quickly. But a lot of these preconceived ideas were born out of things from decades ago. I mean, people go, well, there's the whole Orwellian thing rolling out. Well, think about when that was written in history. Or maybe that's not the greatest example, but we see examples in history where people refer to it. But that no longer applies. The world's moved on. It's a very, very, very different world than it was a decade ago. I mean, or if you've gone 20 years ago, that the US would have been the way it is now, no one would have believed you. People would have said that's impossible. Well, here we are. That's where we are, and the US is in a state of collapse. And this is the other thing. I think the important thing is that every time people hear some policy decision, the Great Reset's a great example. As soon as people heard that, they went, oh, that's this dystopian plan to roll out this dystopian future for all humanity, without asking the question, hang on, why are you assuming that the whole world's embracing what these individuals, as I said, who've delivered nothing in all the years they've been turning up in Davos? They talk a lot, go home, and nothing happens. But people have now embraced that because they've gone, oh, it's come on out the back of this pandemic. And the natural assumption is, well, they're saying this because it was always a long-held plan. Again, they're going to collapse the world. That's been this long-held mantra in the alt media. They're deliberately collapsing everything. Well, if that was a reality, then why didn't they do it in 2008? Because China was much weaker. Russia was much weaker. There was no multipolar world. There was no rollout of the Belt and Road Initiative. None of this existed. If they wanted to collapse it, they'd have collapsed it then. But what did they do? They did everything to keep it going. So we have to be careful that we don't jump to conclusions. And, okay, we'll come to the pandemic. Someone's made a question of digital currency. Digital currency is a great question because
just before we get to that, I just wanted to make the point while we wrap up QAnon and all that.
Okay. Nonsense. Yeah, sure.
As you said before, it gave people a feeling of euphoria. Now, when everything didn't pan out, people that realised that it's not panning out and nothing's going to happen, they are going to suffer from a huge low because that they've believed in has not come to pass. So it's been dangerous it's dangerous on a social. It makes you wonder who comes up with it. Is it intelligence based, or is it just some kid in his mum's bedroom?
Well, I think it originally started just with a group of people. I think it was compromised, and it seems you would think it had fingerprints from the intelligence agencies in the US all over it. It kind of looks that way. I mean, it's a great way where you go to get people to believe in, oh, there's all these secret messages in these Q drops. And people engage with it, and it made them feel important, made them feel, oh, I'm part of this process, this plan's coming to fruition. And I'm going to waste countless hours and days, weeks and months deciphering all these things. And of course, that was deliberate just to waste people's time. But equally, there's been a lot of ideas put out that are very detrimental, they're very negative, they drive fear. And the idea that the alt media is never being compromised by the intelligence agencies, it would be for me silly to believe that's not possible, because it's very obvious at times it has happened. So whilst you want to have the euphoria on the one side, there is also the element that they'd like to drive fear into people to believe that all these things are going to happen. Because if you drive fear into people, you paralyze them. They feel helpless. They feel the world's never going to change.
They give away power.
Yeah, and the problem is every time something, someone hears something now, they immediately think, oh, this is going to change the world. This is going to be this global governance takeover. Well, as I said, look at what the rest of the world's doing. Don't focus on the West, which is collapsing and is actually and also is getting smaller and smaller. Just look at what the rest of the world's doing, because the rest of the world's moving on. It's moving on to a future world that won't have the dollar as the world's reserve currency, won't have the US as a hegemon anymore. It won't have Western intelligence agencies trying to start wars and regime changes, and it won't have these big corporations dictating anymore. Because this is the point. Since the pandemic, everyone's going, all the wealth's being concentrated into the hands of you, and they're deliberately collapsing everything. Well, to an extent, yeah, we are seeing small businesses collapse, but ultimately, the big corporations are collapsing. Because if you close off all the travel around the world, and have all these lockdowns and lack of international travel, what's going to happen? All the big airlines go bust. All the Boeing will go bust. The hospitality sector, everything goes bust. And this is a lot of that is big corporations, big interests have huge money involved. They'll lose it all. It's like the Western banking system is not sustainable. It will collapse. The oil and gas sector in the West is collapsing, and it knows if it doesn't evolve, it'll collapse. So what are they all doing, these corporations? They're going, we've got to find a way out or we will collapse. And they're going, where can we go to? So Western financial institutions are begging the Chinese for a piece of their market. And China's going, well, you can, but here's the problem. You're not going to do what you did in the West. You're going to play by our rules. You're going to do things in the manner that we believe is fitting. You're not going to be speculating and screwing our financial system over. So if you want to do things legitimately, you can. If you don't, go away. We're not interested. So they're all scrabbling to join the new world as well. That's what the whole Davos Great Reset is they're sat there going, we're in big trouble. Our big corporations are collapsing. We need to evolve. How can we evolve? How can we actually try to assume any level of what we previously once had? And when an empire collapses, it's going to have to go to the part of the world where the resurgent empire is growing. Well, that's not the West. The West is going to be having major problems for a decade, 20 years before it recovers. We don't know. But the problem is that we assume, as always, as I said, in the West, that they control everything. So when this collapse happened, so yeah, in the short term, the so-called fractions of 1% might pay lots of paper billion dollars, but if they try and liquidate or realize that money, it'll be worthless, because when the dollar collapses, you can have $1 trillion, but what's the point in having it? Because no one in the world will take your dollars anymore. So that's an important distinction with regards to when people perceive that, and that's the other thing. If we actually believe, and we'll come back to the digital currency, I haven't forgotten that, but when this pandemic broke out, okay, I'll make this absolutely clear, my perspective on it. I totally disagree with the government policy. The virus is real, but it's being completely badly mismanaged, and not intentionally. The other problem is I totally disagree with the PCR test. All it does is detect maybe remnants of the virus. It doesn't tell you if someone's infected. I've actually had some engagement with the SAGE people. I've actually had email interaction with them with regards to the obvious economic reasons, the psychological reasons, the physiological reasons, all the problems. But the problem is everyone's fixated on case numbers because they think case numbers translates to hospitalization, death, and it's going to consume the NHS, even though how many years have we had governments destroying the NHS through just like, I think we have 2/3 of the number of hospital beds we had a decade ago. So when it comes to the virus, I'm not disputing it's being completely mismanaged, but the idea it's a deliberate plan. Are we seriously to believe that every country on this planet is playing the game, including China, Russia, and Iran, who detest the West and would never be part of any game the West wants to play? So that I do disagree with. But do I agree with government policy? Absolutely not. It's insane what they've done. And the damage they've done is going to be far greater than anything the virus has caused. And unfortunately, they've dug a hole for themselves so deep, they're never going to get out of it now. And I'm not going to get into the whole subject of what were the origins of the virus. That's people believe all manner of things, and I've realized it's pointless trying. All I will say is the virus was discovered in March 2019 in Spain. So it never originated in China. The virus has been circulating for a lot longer than we realize. The interesting fact is it wasn't a problem until we realized we had the virus, and then it became a problem. But anyway, with regards to the whole economic impact of this, there was a lot of people going, it's deliberate. Well, this is why it isn't deliberate. Because if they they've spent the last decade trying to prevent the collapse of this system. They're not suddenly going to go, oh, there's a virus. Let's use this as an opportunity to collapse the very thing we wanted to prevent collapsing. But now we've decided we're going to collapse it, because ultimately, when the whole economy collapses, and people have said, well, ultimately we'll all end up on universal basic income, and that's the plan. Well, if that was true, universal basic income for everyone leads to one thing: this country will turn into Venezuela with hyperinflation at ludicrous amount percentages, because the government can't sustain printing money forever to support the entire, or 20, 30 million of the population. So the end goal isn't universal basic income, because that would be them holding up the white flag going, it's over, we're finished. So there isn't a concerted effort to destroy everything. Yes, the consequences of their actions are they should never have done this. And I wrote to the government back in May saying you just absolutely shouldn't do all these things for these reasons, because you will economically destroy the country. And everything we've seen happening was very predictable. But notice the government's is in blind panic mode now, because they're going, well, everything's getting destroyed. We've made this virus policy. We're not prepared to backtrack on it. And that's why they keep going, no, we'll just keep rolling out the furlough schemes. The problem with the furlough scheme is when it ends, most people won't have a job. And a lot of people don't realize this because the government's trying to convince them magically the economy will switch itself back on whenever this virus ends from their perspective. And that's just not reality. When you destroy an economy, the economy just completely implodes. And sadly, that's where we're heading in the UK and obviously in Europe, the US, etc. But it isn't a deliberate plan, because this is their worst nightmare. Because when the West collapses, then it knows it has to hand the baton over to the East. Because when this all collapses, the world's going to go, we need a solution. And they're going to say to the West, you're not the solution because you caused this. You've destroyed everything. Well, the solution's already existing. It's in the East. It's a completely different way of how the world should function and operate. There isn't going to be a world reserve currency in the future. There wants to be sound money. So the return, we talked about this way back, where we'll return to gold-backed currencies and have sound money and sound financial principles. And the world's already waiting for this, the rest of the world. The problem is the West is going to have to sit there and find a way that it can join the new world, and it's going to have to sit there and reach agreement how all its debt's managed, how all its liabilities are going to be managed, and how the financial system is going to be handled in the future, because it's had its opportunity. Well, it's gone now. And as I say, you can't destroy the financial system in the West, which has controlled everything, and then magically produce another one. And it's a good point to mention digital currencies. The whole digital currency thing is another thing that's being completely blown out of proportion. The digital currency is effectively, we largely now operate with a digital currency. I don't know people who draw all the money out of the bank and have it stashed under a mattress and pay for everything with cash. It doesn't exist. And we've made this point before about the cashless society. It's a myth, because the 1 trillion narco industry alone a year depends solely on cash. If you remove cash, the narco industry would collapse, and the drug cartels would declare war on the nations in the West, quite simply, because you talk about powerful entities. The drug cartels are immensely powerful. They're not going to sit there and go, you've just destroyed my empire. So no, the cashless society isn't a reality. Well, it may become a reality if the narco industry collapses and all the things we know, human trafficking, organ harvesting, prostitution, the whole lot, that is all dependent on cash. So that's why the cashless society is not reality. The digital currency is an entirely different thing. And this is, I can use China as a great example. China's in the process of piloting internally and doing some external thing, the digital yuan. What is that? All that is effectively, here's 1 yuan that exists in my current bank account. I can exchange it into a digital wallet. It's a 1-for-1 exchange. It doesn't create inflation. I've got 100 yuan in my bank account. It becomes 99. I put 1 into my digital wallet. It becomes 1 yuan. I can then go and spend that wherever I want to. It incurs there's no cost. There's no charges for transactions. All businesses will adopt it. it will be adopted globally, and it's the way of China internationalizing the yuan, which is what it's always wanted to do. The US thinks it's a threat to the dollar and it will collapse the dollar, but the dollar's already collapsed. But it's just a way of internationalizing the yuan. That's the point of digital currencies. It will allow trade between nations. You could, on that basis, there's a different trading mechanism. And the digital currency aspect is something that will facilitate payment mechanisms a lot easier. But as China's rightly said, we're not replacing the physical cash. That's not the point of it. It's for international trade. So the idea we have the dollar currently, and there's going to be a digital dollar, makes from the US perspective, it makes no difference. It's not going to change anything because we largely function in a digital monetary world as it is. And the idea that the cash will disappear for the reasons we've just explained, it won't. But as I say, increasingly, most people don't want to use cash because, I mean, I can't remember when I last paid for anything in cash. I only get it's probably 5 years ago. That's why, well, you might occasionally, sometimes I got on a bus or something to go somewhere or whatever, But even now, I wouldn't bother because they've got contactless. Just pay for it, get on a bus and go somewhere. So that's the fundamental. The digital currency is being portrayed as this controlling mechanism. That this is part of this dystopian future. They're going to use these digital currencies. Well, you effectively utilize that. The reason the West's looking at digital currencies is because it's going, China's doing it, we need it. But maybe in the future, there will be a function for this because at some point, the United States will have another dollar. It won't be the existing dollar. And maybe, the digital yuan can be used for trade payments internationally.
The Amero, do you remember that? The Amero,
Sorry?
do you remember that? The Amero.
Well, yeah, but that's another thing. That's kind of dead in the water and
I know.
The dustbin of history. So, no, digital currencies are going to be used as just an additional way for payment mechanism. It's not some dystopian tool to subjugate humanity because they don't need to do that. We already use digital currencies effectively. We already have, every transaction you make is logged in a bank anyway. So it's not like you're going to no longer be able to use cash and all you'll be able to do is use this digital currency. Well, how radically different is that to what you do now? It's not. In fact, it's pretty much identical unless you're one of the very small minority of people who pays for cash in everything. But I don't see many people doing that. So no, it's just a misnomer. The West is looking at digital currencies because it thinks it can utilize them in payment mechanisms. But it's largely a knee-jerk reaction to the fact China's rolling out. Because what's going to happen at some point, China will roll out digital yuan platforms across the world, and people will be trading in the yuan via this digital currency. And it's an easy payment mechanism. It's instantaneous. It's very quick. It's cost effective. And that'll be a mechanism and it's also why, because it's outside the dollar system. And that's precisely why the whole mechanism is to create alternative payment platforms in non-dollar terms. So that's China's motivation for doing it. It's not exactly clear what the West's motivation is because they don't seem to really understand themselves why they need them. Because they already have a payment mechanism. I mean, okay, the euro won't survive, but they don't realize that. But they're looking at a euro payment system because they're looking at what China's doing, going, well, this will be good for international trade, or maybe in some way I can pay for things easier with a digital yuan. But it's not like you're going to not have a bank account anymore, and all your money is going to sit in a digital wallet, and you have no other mechanism by which to pay for things. That simply won't happen. Because at the end of the day, as I said, the cash system has to operate because these nefarious business interests that generate obscene amounts of money totally depend on cash. So unless someone thinks the drug cartels are going to start, and when someone turns up to a drug dealer and goes, will you take my debit card as payment? If anyone imagines that's going to happen, well, of course, that's not reality and anyone can see that.
So if you're, what would you say if you're saying that this virus is real and that they couldn't get everybody in the world to play? Now we don't know whether everyone in the world is playing, do we? I mean, all we get to
No.
see is things that are put on TV about places. And I noticed that in Wuhan, where it's supposed to be, where it started, they had a huge party on New Year's Eve. And I've seen different places where they are partying. If the if the if the if the if it wasn't deliberate,
Mm-hmm.
then why isn't it by now? Why isn't it that by now it should be safe enough to open up pubs and small businesses?
Right.
Because
Okay. Let's.
they're
Go
the
on.
ones that are suffering. It's not Sainsbury's aren't going to go out of business, are they? Tesco's
No.
aren't going to go out of business, but what they call a mum and pop store down the road,
Yes.
is going to go out of business because, and if it's not deliberate, this, then why have they not done everything they can to make sure that that these businesses have been protected?
Right. Okay. Let's take a step back. We'll come to that, but let's talk about what China actually did. Because I know a lot of people. I've worked in China in the past. I've spent time there. I've got friends there. This is the big difference. Why China, its whole economy is open, why everyone's living a normal life, is because, okay, for whatever reason, and we can arguably question because my initial thought was, what prompted China to panic about the virus? And why did they go into this full-blown lockdown? But what China did was it went, because the Chinese people, actually, people might find this surprising, trust the Chinese government. 98% of them trust the government implicitly. So when the government said, lockdown, don't go anywhere, one person in your house does the shopping, the rest of you just shut everything down, stay at home. China had a blitz for a few weeks, and they got the virus under control. That's why, because China and the West was going, this is draconian, this is horrendous what you do. And don't believe all the crap that was written about what went on in China and all these images of what was going on. And there was a huge amount of fake stuff and propaganda that came out. But China did this and it succeeded. The other thing is, and we don't like, China people were all saying, yeah, we'll adopt. Well, their track and trace worked very effectively. And they all installed it. So when China had an outbreak, when two people get it, China knows instantly where it is, how to deal with it. They nip it in the bud and they get it under control. And they do things that in Western nations, we go, that's unacceptable. And at first, the reason why the UK government went, we're going to have herd immunity, is because they didn't believe that they could actually dare to implement this. And what changed their mind was when Italy did what China did. And they looked at Italy, and the Italian people went, okay, we'll agree to this. They went, okay, now we'll try and do that. So that's the background why China is being, China doesn't have the virus. It's under control. People have a normal life because they did things correctly. The West completely screwed up. And here's why the West screwed up. First off, when it should have had the first lockdown, it did it 3 weeks too late. That was the first big problem. So effectively, the numerous horses had bolted and they were shutting stable doors and it was way too late. That was the first problem. The other problem is they had no effective way of detecting anywhere what, hang on, they did have lockdown measures anyway. That's beside the point. The point is, in Beijing wasn't one of the most affected cities. Go to Wuhan, and you'll see exactly what they did. But anyway, that's beside the point. In the United Kingdom, we locked down too late. We never had any track and trace thing in place because everyone said it was mass surveillance. They didn't want it, and in fact, the system didn't work anyway. So we we got stuck in a cycle where we went, well, we're going to have a lockdown. Now we're going to relax the lockdown, but we weren't keeping, because I don't believe it's a massive problem. I'm not suggesting it is. I'm not saying it's a horrendous virus that warranted what we're doing. But the point is, they just stuck themselves in a cycle where, because eventually, as you start to remove restrictions, the virus is going to increase to some degree. And so we've now got stuck in a cycle of lockdown, relaxed restrictions. Oh, we need another lockdown, relaxed restrictions, we need another lockdown. And we're just stuck in this perpetual cycle because they completely mishandled it. The problem is, you're absolutely right. They're not intentionally trying to destroy small businesses. Their policy decision is such that they're not even thinking logically that they're destroying economies. At one point, it transpired, I think Sunak was so furious about what was happening, he threatened to resign from the government because he understood the economic impact. Everyone else was just focusing on the reality of this virus. It's all about case numbers. So the case numbers go up. Now, PCR testing is fundamentally flawed. We know that. So it was almost, to me, there's a point that says, if you stop testing so many people, the virus wouldn't be a problem anymore to a large extent. But it has affected people. I know of people who've had the virus. I know of people who had relatives who were hospitalized. Yeah, it's not a massive problem in terms of it's affecting huge amounts of people, but it's real. The idea that virus isn't real is, for me, that's just, when we start straying into that territory, then we're just going into another kind of version of Q. It's kind of like we're just deciding to say something isn't real because it fits our a belief system. It's real, but it's not as serious as people believe. And the problem is, people are looking at this and their instinct is, our government couldn't be that incompetent. They couldn't be that useless at managing this. It's got to be deliberate. But again, tell me in history when we've ever had a competent government that has done anything that is remotely beneficial to the people.
Because it's always been deliberate. Whatever the government's done has always been deliberate. I mean, I think it's. I think that to say that this is something that required this amount of lockdown and what have you. And my daughter had it. Well, she had something. She was told she'd got something, and they called it COVID-19. And for me, she just had a bit of a cold, right? So,
I'm not disputing any of that. No.
So where people really believe is what they see and what they experience, right? And I know that I get, when I'm looking through Facebook, I'm going to get the videos of people walking around hospitals saying they're empty, and I know that I'm going to get them, so I just dismiss them anyway, right? And I just try to think about it in a critical way, and I like to have people, like I said to you, I like to have people on who've got a different point of view. But for me, my own experience and what I've seen and what I've heard, what I've experienced has been not that there isn't. If there wasn't TV, we wouldn't know there were a pandemic. That's for me how it is. Some people get flu. It's flu season. People get flu.
I agree with you.
What are the flu figures? Are they putting with COVID figures? I don't know. But
we agree because they mysteriously all the flu cases seem to suddenly disappear, which of course is nonsensical. Look, there's no disputing that there's a lot of things that you would arguably say don't make sense. The statistical data doesn't make sense. But that doesn't mean they're deliberately doing what they're doing, because what's their advantage? Why are they destroying everything? Why would they do it? Because here's the problem, right? How do they know how 67 million people in the UK are going to react to the fact that They destroy all the economy. They destroy people through psychologically, the damage they're going to do, the damage they'll do to children, the damage they're going to do to families when they don't have jobs in the future, the risk they don't pay their bill, they can't pay their mortgage or their rent, they're struggling to feed themselves. How, if they were deliberately doing this, how are they so confident they can control 67 million people driven into utter destitution?
They can't.
Exactly.
There'll have to be army on streets and things like that. People are going to have to be given money, you know, like they've been getting stimulus checks in America.
Well, yeah, but you can't. That's not sustainable long term.
Of course, it's not sustainable, but it's the idea is to make people dependent on government. So there's no going in and buying something from a little shop and the guy not paying the VAT on it. You know, the guy not charging the VAT or paying it. There's none of that anymore because everything's coming from either IKEA if you're getting your or if you Oak Furniture Land. Right. So everybody's can be. There's no boozers, and there'll not be any boozers anymore. There might be a few restaurants, but not going to be any boozers left. They're all gone. So people can't sit and talk and exchange ideas. They have to do it now. Everyone's been forced online. They've been trying to force us online for a number of years, and now we are pretty much everybody's online, and that's how people are living their lives, and that's how people. And you see, once that's everybody's online, the government can see things. You know, they can see what they've got algorithms, and it's not all about, you know, some evil, you know, genius that's what wants to look after or understand better the world. It's just that they're then selling that information to companies. We've got a corporatocracy. It's companies. It's big companies that are behind all this, and government are doing the work for them. You know, they're getting rid of the competition, and they're getting
yeah. But here's the problem with if that were the case, right? I mean, at some point, they're not going to be able to keep people locked down for in perpetuity. We're not going to be sat here in 10 years going, we're still in lockdown. So at some point, this lockdown has to end, okay? Because it will end. Because if it doesn't end, they're going to have a major problem with civil disobedience. People will not tolerate this indefinitely. That there's an inevitability to that. And they can't control that either. Again, we're talking about trying to control how 60 odd million people in a country are going to react. Here's the other problem. If they keep where they destroy the backbone of this country and there's 30 million people unemployed, well, the big corporations you're talking about, no one's going to be buying anything from them because they won't have any money to buy anything. So therefore, the big corporations will go bust as well in the process because people won't be buying stuff from them anymore because they won't have any money to buy stuff.
There'll be need for more. There will be, because there'll be need for more marshals, and again, people reliant on government jobs. I know they'll probably be working for a private company, but it'll be a government job. So you've got a need. Yeah,
but that doesn't produce, and there's no economy there. You're not, and it's not sustainable. All you're going to end up with on that basis is we'll end up with Venezuela, with hyperinflation, people starving, massive social unrest. And because that's the only inevitable conclusion. If people follow this to the logical conclusion and you destroy everything, then everything's gone. So there won't be a corporation anymore for people to buy stuff from because they won't have any money to buy it. The entire financial system and banking system will have no money to be able to speculate on because there won't be any money to speculate with. So the entire backbone, there'll be no military industrial complex because there'll be no money to be able to fight a war with. So the problem is that if you follow this through to that logical conclusion, they're destroying their entire empire. So again, why would they do that? They don't need to control, and the idea they need to control us anymore, they don't need to. Why? Why? They need us to function in their system enough to believe we benefit from it, even if we don't, because they need us all to be working to finance their system. If we're not working, we're not financing their system anymore. Their system then would then just be giving us handouts, which is printed money, which creates Weimar Germany in Britain, and we all know what happened there. Everything collapses. So their entire structure is gone. And when it's gone, then it's gone, because empires don't magically destroy themselves. And then, because if they wanted to start again, we're going to have to create a society where people have jobs. So we earn money. So then we buy into this system. We buy goods from their corporations, etc. We pay taxes. We're okay, and then that money's spent however it's spent. But you can't have a society that functions on everybody being on universal basic income, because you've got Weimar Germany, and then there'll be nothing. People will be starving to death in the streets. People will be homeless. And we're not talking small, the which we've had historically, where they've screwed the poorest people into the ground. We're going to have pretty much most people in this country destitute. You're not going to control a nation of 50 million people destitute. You don't have the resources to control it. Now, are we seriously to believe that they're going to play Russian roulette and take that risk? For what purpose? They don't need to control us any more than they already do. They have, if they want to know what you and I are doing, which they don't, because they're not interested, unless we become a matter of interest, they can surveil us anyway. They can surveil us with our mobile phone, with any technology we use. They can do it already if they really want to surveil us. But they're not interested in what most of us do, because we're all, I mean, with all due respect, most of us lead pretty boring, uneventful lives. I mean, what do we do that's of any interest? But again, that's the idea that's being cultivated, that they're creating this surveillance society. They've been able to surveil us for decades.
Well, yeah,
they don't need to do it any more than they've already done.
Yeah, look, we're getting miles away. What I was going to say was, I was going to ask, actually, if anybody knew what percentage of the economy is small independent businesses, because if we're looking at they're the ones that are going to go,
yes,
and it's only a small percentage of the economy, then we're sort of like taking a bunch of people. We are putting a lot more people on dole, and also there's going to be, like somebody said earlier, it's an attack on the middle class. So you've got this guy who's got this, like, let's just say, for example, a microbrewery, and he sells locally. He makes a decent enough living. He lives out in Penistone in his nice house, and I mean, he's knackered. He's gone, isn't it? He's not going to be able to sustain his business, and because his business was doing okay before, he's got a mortgage which is I don't know, 1,500 quid a month, which is a big mortgage down here, up here, by the way. He's knackered. So I mean, you're taking out a big chunk of what you'd call middle class people, and if that's only a fraction of what the economy is as a whole, then you're not really. All you're doing is you're putting some people onto benefits who were working for them people, and you're just utterly destroying the people that are owning and running these businesses.
Well, actually, the vast bulk of businesses in the UK are small, medium enterprises. So people up to 250 employees. That's the vast bulk of this country. You've got.
Is that the economy though? I mean, as the economy as a whole, what percentage do they create of GDP.
Oh, you mean in terms of GDP?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know whether there's any statistical data. I mean, but it's quite significant. I mean, if the vast bulk of businesses in the UK are small, medium enterprise, okay, there's an argument. Big corporations obviously account for a significant slice of it. But I don't know off the top of my head the percentage of GDP, but I think probably, I mean, I'm slightly guessing, but I would suspect small, medium enterprises probably in terms of GDP account for probably 60% of this country's GDP, roughly. Maybe 55, 60%, something like that. So it's a sizable amount. This is why you're absolutely right. The policy decision is what it does is that this is the chronology of what it affects. It first of all affects the self-employed, because there's quite a lot of people who scandalously are self-employed who've received no money for 12 months. You know, they weren't allowed to be furloughed or claim any grants. So that they get affected. Small businesses, yes, are immediately going to be impacted. And then, of course, you've then got, I don't know the exact figures, there was a cumulative figure back in December of nearly 10 million people furloughed. Now, the reason the vast majority are furloughed is because their job is very unlikely to exist once they come off furlough. Not everybody, but a significant proportion. Now, that affects all manner of people. That can be people in the low income brackets or middle income brackets or higher income brackets. So ultimately, yes, there is, and what always happens when there's a collapse throughout history, and I think we said this way back, the middle class are the ones who get wiped out the most. Why? Because they generally have the most leverage. If people are in the sort of poor income brackets, I hate the whole class system, but just for the thing, what people are perceived as working class, which I think is a horrible title, but that's what people use. Maybe people who are in lower income brackets, they generally, the ones, well, except, in this time, because obviously the economic collapse this time is far greater than we've had, even compared to 2008, but they generally lose the less because they're less leveraged. A lot of people middle class tend to buy more expensive houses. They tend to take more, or they give more loans. They'll buy things on credit, and of course, we've had a massive credit explosion in this country. So, yeah, history, the middle class gets wiped out. But the problem is when you start to wipe out all those sections, which is the vast bulk of people. The top end depend on you and I. Corporations don't make massive profits unless they sell us products and services. That's how they make their money. So if you wipe us all out and we don't have any money anymore, they're going to go bust because no one's going to buy their stuff anymore. You're not going to have 30 million unemployed people traipsing every week to IKEA to buy furniture, are you? They don't have the money. So IKEA will go bust. It's like, that's why this idea that somehow these corporations are an island and they're going to survive, but the rest of us get obliterated, but somehow they survive. That doesn't stack up. That's not how real world economics works. The system works because they convince enough of us to believe that we're doing okay out of this system. Yeah, it's not great, but I go to work, I earn the money, I've got a house, I've got a car, I can afford this, my family can buy it. But as soon as you rip that illusion away from them, and they lose, I mean, you imagine the amount of people who lose their jobs, who can't, and suddenly they're so leveraged, I can't pay my bills, I can't pay my mortgage, or maybe I can't pay my rent. And their pension may be decimated because of what the fallout of this. The whole future, when this changes the whole dynamic, this isn't a boom bust financial collapse that affected the stock market, affected a few people more in the richer income bracket who probably got wind of what was happening and bailed out before it collapsed. This isn't a 2008 collapse, which was the financial system, which they then protected. They ring-fenced the financial system. This is the thing. This is the big thing. 2008, they bailed all the banks out. Everybody knows that. And then they've kept bailing out that. But they kept that massive inflationary bubble inside Wall Street, inside the City of London, inside banks. And while they kept it inside the bubble, it kind of worked for them. Here's the big problem with the pandemic. The pandemic decapitated them. And it decapitated them for this reason. Because they kept the illusion inside this bubble. When the pandemic struck, they suddenly went, we can't keep the bubble inside the monetary system. Now we're going to have to pump the fiscal system, which is money to you and I, which is their worst nightmare, because that puts this inflationary bubble in the high street. Why is that a problem? Because everything's eventually going to get more and more expensive. You're going to have food price inflation, everything. And couple that with the fact people are losing their jobs. And it's like a double, triple whammy. So the pandemic was their worst nightmare, because now the problem is actually leaking into Main Street, not Wall Street. They never wanted that to happen. They thought they could fix the financial system, keeping the bubble inside Wall Street, not actually realizing that their policy was going to destroy the real economy eventually, because you can't do what they do. Now, okay, the pandemic accelerated that collapse, but back in 2016, I stated very clearly then that the Western financial system was going to collapse. It was we would have complete economic collapse. The virus is merely an accelerant, but this is their worst nightmare, because now they're going, the central bank's going, we can't do anything anymore, which they can't. They could pump $100 trillion tomorrow. It does nothing. It resolves nothing. It's not going to save any single financial institution. It's not going to save any corporation. And that's the other thing. All these big corporations are saddled with enormous debt. Well, when that system blows up, they're going to blow up with the debt. So you kind of have this idea that they're immune from the system, that they've destroyed themselves. And somehow we're the only people that it's going to affect. But as I said, we're like the drones. We're the drones, effectively, inside the hive that have to do all the work to keep their system going. When we no longer participate in it because we're all unemployed, or we simply have no disposable income, it's over. Their system's gone. That's why they spent the last decade trying to prevent this happening, because they knew the moment it leaked into Main Street, they were in serious trouble. But we've seen this. Look at how many corporations are making massive redundancies as well, because it's not sustainable. This system was never sustainable. They've destroyed. They cooked their golden goose through their own crass, reckless policies. That everyone was, it's bad. Yeah, the system benefited them, but only to the massive detriment of the real economy. And ultimately, once the real economy goes, so does their entire system collapses. So this is not to their benefit. They are absolutely panicking, because they now know the game's up. That's why they're accelerating this massive demonization of China, particularly because they're going, blimey, if the world keeps adopting China and adopting the Chinese new methodology, that's going to also accelerate the collapse. Why? Because everyone's investing in China and trading in non-dollar terms, and the dollar's basically the oil in the engine. When you take the oil out, the engine seizes up and it dies. And that's the reality of what's unfolding. And what proves the point is everything we talked about 4 or 5 years ago, what I said, that's what's unfolding now. Because you could see precisely what was going to happen. Okay, we couldn't predict it exactly in the future when it would happen. But this is not a controlling mechanism. This is a mechanism that's failing. And so the idea that they can, turn us all into slaves for government handouts, it's not a sustainable model. You can't have a Western system that operates on the basis of everyone being destitute and unemployed. It doesn't work. You'll have that on a short-term basis, and then the entire thing will collapse because we'll have hyperinflation. Because what causes hyperinflation is when you keep printing money, which they'd have to do, and people would have to keep spending it, and people would end up having to spend it faster and faster because things would get more and more expensive. And in the end, if you have, I don't know, let's say 30 million people who can't feed themselves because they're that destitute, and don't imagine that's not reality coming. Do you really think they can control a system with people in that much state of destitution? You couldn't do it. You couldn't. That's their biggest fear, is that people suddenly are in a situation where they're not functioning in this system and believing it's working for them. Well, most people. Obviously, there are plenty of people who don't, but they still function in that system. Their worst nightmare is when everyone goes, hang on, let me get this straight. You told us the economy was fine. Then we had this pandemic, which you mishandled. You've blown all the economy up. This is all your fault. I've lost everything. And they're just going to sit at home and go, that's fine. I don't have a problem with this. Absolutely not. And the West has never had this situation. Because if you go back historically to the Great Depression in the US, where actually there wasn't, and that's the other thing, there wasn't any debt like it is then. And the entire thing was magnitudes different. But in that situation, people didn't have the things that, we didn't live in this materialistic society. We didn't live in a society that was geared around the way it is now. And yeah, there was extremely hard time for huge amounts of Americans. But that was nearly 100 years ago. The world's not like that anymore. People, as I use this very crude analogy, when there's a ton of manure on people's doorsteps and they can't open the door, they're not going to tolerate it. They'll tolerate it for now because people think, oh, I'm on furlough, I'm getting 80% of my salary. When this all ends, I'll have a job. Well, sadly, a lot of people won't have a job. The reason they're on furlough is because if they weren't on furlough, they wouldn't be getting paid anything. The furlough is just a way of disguising a massive economic problem in the making. So no, absolutely not. This is not deliberate. This is their worst nightmare, and their worst nightmare is panning out. And they have no answer. And yes, the whole virus policy is absurd. It's absolutely insane from an economic standpoint. From the fact that
it's more than insane, isn't it? I mean, it feels like they're asset stripping because it's a bit like when some squatters are going to have been served notice and they've got to get out of a place and then they fuck it up. And I think it's it might be here's a conspiracy theory for you. That's what they're doing. The government are doing that as we speak because America used us as collateral for a loan, and now they've not paid a couple of payments. So it just seems crazy to me. Just crazy. I can't even comprehend how anybody would be so stupid. It had to, we've always had this, haven't we? Incompetent or corrupt. They do coexist. They do. There is corruption, immense corruption, but they are fundamentally crassly incompetent. And here's the reason: what they did in 2008. Was not a solution. It was 2008 was the wake-up call that said the game's up. The Western financial system is completely bust. But they went, no, we're not having that. We're going to do the following policy. And the policy did the decision they made. Once they'd invoked it for more than 3 to 6 months, they'd sign their own death sentence. It was only a matter of time. It wasn't going to happen instantaneously. But that was the most crass decision they have ever made. I could list you 100 crass decisions they've made in the last 5 years globally. Ukraine. The Ukraine Maidan was one of the most
idiotic decisions they've ever made. The ramifications were enormous. It was one of the pivotal moments when the dollar, or the destruction of the dollar, occurred. There's one example. The idea they could march into Syria and depose Assad. There's another example. Another example is all the regime change they've tried to implement in the last few years. Absolutely insane policy. The way the Western financial systems behaved in the last decade, insanity and incompetence and stupidity. We should actually be grateful they are that stupid, because if they actually had a brain and had actually done the things they could have done, they could have fixed things in 2008. It wouldn't have kept things going forever, but they could have done the simple thing. Let the banks go because they didn't need them. And then what they could have done is they could have refloated the economy in a way that would have benefited them in the long term. Because, believe it or not, they're not intentionally going out of their way to destroy the likes of you and I. Unfortunately, we always tend to be collateral damage, and everyone perceives it's deliberate. But as I say, without us, they don't have a functioning system. They depend on us to spend all the money we have propping up their corporations, keeping their banks afloat. Well, not necessarily exactly, but we deposit our money in their banks. That's the other thing. If we're all on universal basic income or the equivalent, apart from the hyperinflationary collapse, the other thing is people are not going to have enough to live on. So they're permanently going to be spending it. So literally, how many people are going to have money in? And you'd end up with bank runs in the end, which would collapse banks in the process. Because if everybody draws all their cash out of banks, or they have no money in banks, there's no money, then banks can't, it's not sustainable. That's what causes bank runs. So none of this is sustainable long term. Short term, yeah, you can furl it, but the government's going to now be going, well, it's how much money, and they're printing this money. This is just printed money. £1 trillion. They're never going to get that money back. There's nowhere, no one's going to, what they're going to do, have austerity and close the entire country down to pay for it. It's not sustainable. So people go, we'll be paying for this for generations. We won't be, because it's not possible to do this. As I say, as soon as you push people to the point where they lose everything, people don't react well to that. I mean, it's one thing us talking about the fact that, all the problems we're seeing, but what happens if you have 10 million people going to be thrown out on the streets and are homeless? What's going to happen with them? Are they just going to go and sleep in a park somewhere and go, oh, I'm happy with this? No, of course they're not. That's why you can't destroy something, because the consequences for destroying something are severe. And there's no way they're doing this deliberately, because they, as I said, they can't control the outcome. There's like 1,000 spinning plates that are all interacting, and we're supposed to believe that they can control this precisely so there's no collateral damage. They can keep their system going. We all end up destitute and needing universal basic income. They can do all this, but they couldn't remove Assad in Syria. They couldn't collapse Ukraine and drag Russia into a war. We can list 100 examples of their failures. They can't manage something in one country, yet they can manage this whole collapse all over the world. It's not possible. It's just simply but this is this idea they're all powerful, they're all controlling. They're not all powerful and all controlling. That's an illusion.
Well, I mean, we're all in his houses for for what is to most people is just something that most people recover from. 99.99 wherever.
Yeah. Yes, I agree.
We're all in his houses, so they are powerful, aren't they? They've kept everyone in their house.
No, but that's not power.
Well, of course it is.
No, it's weakness. That isn't doing that isn't powerful. Putting that, trying to impose that kind of regime on people isn't power. It's weakness. I mean, in history, when you have to have draconian empires like that, it's weakness. They might try, people might feel they're projecting some power, but they're not doing this. They're doing this because okay, here's the point, right? Look at what happened in last summer. We started to unlock everything, and things looked to be heading quite positively. All the numbers fell off a cliff edge, and then all of a sudden they went into blind panic in September. And I can remember at the time thinking, what the hell? Why are they suddenly locking everything down? Okay, the logical conclusion is that we're turning into the flu season. And I wrote an article on my own website saying they're going to conflict flu cases with the coronavirus. I mean, yeah, but there was obviously something else. And the something else we subsequently found out around Christmas is they detected a variant, or what they said was a variant. Now, here's the problem with viruses. And I think this is the nub of why they're doing what they're doing. I don't agree with it. I don't think it's the right strategy. But if you've got people in terms of SAGE whose job is to stop the virus spreading, they're going to be extremely ultra cautious whereas to us, you go, this is too extreme. But you imagine if it was that you were in the position where your policy decisions could have, okay, we can sit here because we're not involved in this process, and we can look at it objectively and go, well, this is completely draconian. But if you're the person making policy decisions and you think, if I make the wrong decision and a whole bunch of people die, there may be comeback on me. I may be personally held responsible in the future for making those decisions. But here's the point with regards to, sorry?
An MP's been personally held responsible. That's never happened before.
No, but we're talking about a situation where they perceive, well, this isn't forget how we rationally think things through. If you're in a high pressure situation where your decision can mean life and death to someone, you're going to have a different perspective. I'm not agreeing with it. I'm just saying that's human nature. If you actually were in that situation yourself, you'd be a bit more, okay, what happens if this happens or this happens? But here's the problem with viruses. We all know viruses mutate. Now there's a risk. The coronavirus in its present form clearly is pretty mild. It doesn't affect most people. And there's, yes, I totally agree. There's this whole argument is how many people are dying of coronavirus when in fact they died of something else. No, I'm not disputing any of that. The point is, though, the virus can go one of two ways. It can mutate, and it can end up because we've already got 4 coronaviruses circulating at the moment, have been for 20 years, 10 years, whatever. And they're just like a common cold, no problems. That's fine if it mutates and ends up mutating into something. The risk is, though, variants could actually mutate into something worse. And this is possible. So if they're sat there going, there's a new variant, we don't know what the outcome is going to be with this new variant. If the risk is it gets worse, and you're sat there going, what decision do I make? The logical conclusion is you're going to play it safe. You're going to go, I don't know whether this is going to be worse. If it's worse, we may end up with a serious problem, for argument's sake. So they'll sit there and go, actually, we've got to be on the side of caution. Now, for us looking in from the outside, the argument is this makes no sense, but that's the risk with a virus. It can become worse, or it can become, now, maybe the risk of it getting worse is pretty small. But as I said, if you're sat there making decisions, you're going to go, I'm not going to take that risk. And we can't, because we can't eliminate the fact that it's as simple as that. Now, I'm not agreeing with all the decisions that were made. I think there was numerous very bad policy decisions going back. The PCR test, as I said, I don't agree with it. I think it doesn't detect if someone's infectious. So therefore, it's not a basis to determine case numbers. No doubt. But the idea that all these things are some nefarious plan. So what we're basically saying is all the people in hospitals are in on this. There's these enormous network of people all around every country, all part of some nefarious process to deceive us into
I mean,
believing.
that's a moot point. I mean, there only needs to be a few people that are actually that actually know the absolute truth, and the people that I mean, the people that are doing the job, they are going to be, they're going to think what they're told to think, right? That's what.
Well, I mean, I know some. Like, I know there's a friend of mine whose wife's pretty senior in a hospital down south, and he gives me kind of regular updates as to what's going on in the hospital. And as he says, apart from and he said things have got worse around Christmas time. They've had more people in hospital. They've had more fatalities. But the one thing he said is the morale of hospital staff is deteriorating rapidly because they're having to deal with very stressful, high-pressure situations. But as I say, you can't have this. Look, if you have a centralized policy decision, I mean, let's look at it this way. Let's look at what happened in Syria. It's a slight diversion, but there's a good case in point. Someone somewhere, intelligence agency goes, we need a war with Assad because he's not allowing us to put the energy pipelines. You don't have to convince any. Do you know what you do? You go to the intelligence agencies, go to President, Obama at the time, Cameron, and goes, we have credible intelligence information that Assad's massacring his people, he's committing acts of genocide, he's doing all those things. The rest of the process it just takes care of itself because there's only one very small central point of failure. When you're talking about every hospital in this country, every doctors, all the people, we're saying that all these people, they're all part of the centralized process. They're not 4 steps away from where the centralized process exists that dictates the mandate. They're at the coalface end of this every single day. You can't hoodwink that many people. And you can't do this globally, that the vast bulk of countries are all doing the same thing. It doesn't mean that the policy is correct. It doesn't mean that the statistical data that people are presenting that contradicts them is wrong. But it doesn't mean it's nefarious. We have to sometimes accept the fact that we live in a world that's crassly incompetent. Our governments are absolutely useless, and we should be more worried about how they're not going to handle the impact of all the financial impact, the economic implosion, the societal impact. They won't have a clue how to deal with this. That's the problem. But the idea that they're all part of some big game, and I mean, so Iran is not going to do anything. Do you know what Iran would have done? If Iran would have gone, we've got no cases, we have no one's dying, what are you talking about? This is bullshit. They didn't. They've got problems. So is Russia. And these nations don't owe the West anything. They're not going to be party to some sinister game the West's playing. They would have actually done if it was a sinister, nefarious game, they would have done the exact opposite and gone, we don't have a problem. What are you talking? And then the West would have looked at this and gone, what? So the virus isn't a problem here, 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 and here. Venezuela, Cuba, all these nations, they're not in the back pocket of the idea that there's this controlling mechanism. Look at Sweden. Sweden bucked the trend. Why did Sweden buck the trend if they're part of the Western sphere of influence? So there are all these contradictions that don't stack up, that it's deliberate. The problem is people think they couldn't be that incompetent, they couldn't be that useless. But they are that incompetent and that useless. And here's why, apart from anything else. When did we last have a major crisis in this country? World War II. Yeah, okay, the 70s was pretty dire for a lot of people, and 3-day working weeks, power cuts and whatever. But it's not like it is now. We haven't had to deal with real adversity for 75 years. We're just not equipped to handle it. We're not equipped to deal with it. And and let's face it, the one thing we have in governance positions, there's no meritocracy. We don't have the right people in government. We have a bunch of stooges, people who are just part of the system, and they don't have a clue what they're doing. They don't have any qualification, any capability. So here's the problem. If your sage advisors, or whatever they're called now, come to you and go, we're deeply concerned about this, we think there's this huge risk. If you're sat there, you're not going to go, actually, I'm going to ignore you because I don't believe you. And then 3 weeks later, what they say happens. Your head's going to roll in a serious way as a prime minister. And if it's proven that you ignored the advice and subsequently what they said came to pass, the consequences could be dire for the person concerned, because then you're talking about deliberately, willfully not doing what you were advised to do, and the consequences are a whole bunch of people died as a result of it. You're not going to take that risk. So it's not nefarious behavior.
I find that quite a political answer. Some of the
no, it's not political.
But let me ask you this: are you going to be taking the vaccine?
No.
No.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
No. Look. I'm. What I'm doing is all I've said about so far about this is based on my interaction and conversations and emails I've had with people because I've emailed people in the government, I've emailed people in Sage, I've had discussions with them. Look, the plain simple fact is this isn't a nefarious plan. There is no benefit to having this as a nefarious plan. Look, here's the thing: if they wanted to control everybody, and which they don't need to because they control us anyway, as much as they need to, they're not going to invent a fake pandemic. There's far easier ways to control people and instigate mass surveillance if they wanted to. Look at what the US did with the Patriot Act in 2011. That was when the big change happened. That was when they were allowed to carte blanche do whatever they want, how they wanted, when they wanted. It gave them enormous power in terms of surveillance. That was when that event happened. Everyone thinks it's happening now. No, it happened a decade ago, nearly. Well, in the aftermath of September the 11th. Well, actually, it's nearly 20 years ago. Sorry. That's when that happened. That's when all that happened, and that all got forgotten. And people think, no, it's a control power grab. Everything that was needed to surveil us was implemented then. But the truth is, they're not interested in us. They don't care what we say and do and think. We're no threat to them. We don't challenge them. I mean, look, we can talk tonight about things, but we're not a threat to them. We don't have a million people listening to us. They're not interested in us. That's the other thing. People think there's all these people sat in GCHQ listening to them. The amount of resources they would need to listen and to everything people were talking about on a daily, weekly, monthly basis would be so great. It's not worth it. They don't need to do that. They don't want to do it. They have no desire to do it.
They do monitor what everyone's saying, because they have algorithms and things that they listen out for words, certain words, keywords. So we do know that they do chatter.
Oh, so. Yes, that's what I said. Yes, I mean, but they're not intentionally listening to everything we say. That's the point. Yeah, I don't dispute. I've said we have surveillance. Of course we do. But the surveillance has existed for a very long time, and it's not look. This is one of these situations, right? For the old media, the virus was manna from heaven. It was there. Wow, we've got our moment when we could sell all these grand ideas about all this. They must have sat there when this happened and gone, "This is fantastic. We have never had a better opportunity to sell all these amazing grand ideas." Rather like the Q movement sold all these amazing ideas that never happened. Rather like in the aftermath of the presidential election in the US, all these grand ideas. None of them have ever happened. And it was just an opportunity. Look, here's a great example. The whole link between 5G and the virus. There's people having concerns about 5G, absolutely fine. No problem. Same as you would have with 4G. But there's no connection. But that was sold. People believed it. They went around smashing 5G towers because they thought it caused the virus. The question they didn't ask themselves is, Iran doesn't have any 5G, so why has it got all these virus cases? China's got more 5G base stations than any other nation on this planet. It doesn't have any virus. So the whole argument falls apart. But people bought into that. And why? Because you just conveniently link 5G. I know, we'll lump the virus in, and then we'll sell everyone the idea that 5G and the virus is linked in some way. It's not linked at all. There's absolutely no evidence to support it, but people believe it. So the virus was this great opportunity to go, right, let's work out an end scenario we want, and let's reverse engineer it back to where we are. And then we can keep selling people, this is happening all because it means this. This is happening because it means that. And then in the real world, that's not how it works. That doesn't mean there's not corruption. That doesn't mean there's people not financially benefiting from this, taking advantage of it. It doesn't mean that doesn't, but that doesn't mean there's this overarching nefarious plan. Because at some point, when this virus ends, which it will do, when the government finally realizes that its policy is not sustainable or whatever happens at some point, and life goes back to normal, which, okay, and then there's this idea like, yeah, life won't go back to normal because the world's going to change because the Western world's blown up. But when we don't have lockdowns, when we can come and go and do all things, when we eventually reach that point, then we're going to have the same discussion we had, like the Q discussion, which is, see, it's all proved to not happen. And all the people who've said it all move on to the next thing to justify why they believe this thing's going to happen. They're not doing this. There's no nefarious plan. There really isn't, because no one benefits from this. I mean, you can't. Ultimately, it destroys everything. Absolutely everything will be destroyed.
And a lot of people think that that's the plan. Listen, Paul,
okay, granted, but as I've said, it doesn't. They can think that, but so they destroy everything, and then what? Okay, here's a good question. Let's assume these people are correct. They destroy everything. What then? What happens when they've destroyed everything? What's their understanding then of what happens?
Well, then we probably end up in a situation like you've got in Brazil, where you've got like shanty towns and poverty and like these bits, and then and how does that benefit? There's a stone throw between the poor and the rich.
No, but hang on. How are they going to be rich in that system?
Well, the people that are already rich. I don't think they're going to not be rich.
But when you blow the system up, the entire fiat currency system is destroyed. A billion pounds now is not going to be £1 billion in a hyperinflationary financial system that blows up. It'd be worthless. And their corporations will go bust because nobody. Right. Look. Here's the thing. This is how. Right. Brazil. Okay. Brazil's not entirely a shanty, but let's just assume you're correct. Do you know why Brazil's elite thrive? Because their big corporations are selling across the world to nations like us who have money. If their big corporations have no one to sell to, they'll be all living in shanty towns. You can't have a financial system that wrecks and destroys 3/4 or 99% of the world, but somehow the 1% are just going to sit there creaming all the money in while the rest of us are destitute. It doesn't work. It's impossible. That's why I'm saying, when you take people through to the logical conclusion of what they think it means, and then what? And it doesn't work. And the other thing is, do you think 30, 40 million people are going to live in shanty towns in this country and go, I'm happy with that? Do you think that would happen?
Well, they've got no choice, have they?
No, it's not a question. You've taken them out of their nice homes, their relatively nice lifestyle, where they have their job, they have their car, they have their material possessions, they have their, and you're gonna decapitate them and take it all away from them, and people are just going to sit there and tolerate that. You really you think people would do that?
We're in the biggest open prison in the world. We're tolerating this. We're tolerating this.
Yeah, but we're tolerating this because we still have a degree of a lifestyle that people think, well, actually, I don't like the system, but I'm doing okay with it. You're talking about taking people's creature comforts away and things they like and a roof over their head, and saying you're going to live in squalor. People aren't going to tolerate that. And you think they've worked out that they know exactly that all the people in the United Kingdom are just going to go, yeah, I'm happy with this. You mean they've calculated that this can work, but they can't defeat Assad in Syria, but they can somehow work this out in the United Kingdom. Look at the magnitude of difference and complexity and variables in that equation. Everyone thinks they can do that, but they can't do all these other things because they're absolutely clueless, useless, and they don't know how to do it. But somehow they magically can do it. Honestly, it doesn't stack up. You're talking about something that's impossible with too many variables. Because here's the point: if they reduced us all to destitution, all it would need is people, 1 million, 2 million people to uprise, and that'd be the end of it. The system, whatever system they had left, which wouldn't even be functional. People wouldn't tolerate that. They're never going to. That's the one thing they're terrified of, is that they disengage us with the system so much and they destroy it that people go, hang on, I've lost everything. I'm not going to tolerate this. And you're already, I mean, okay, we have to be careful on this, but look at the Netherlands. They've had 3 nights of riots, protests. Okay, there's some infiltration and people smashing things up to discredit real protesters. That's a pretty moderate nation. But they're reaching breaking point because they put them in a curfew between 8:30 and 4:30. You really think if they destroy them and take them all out their homes, and they're living on bread and water and they're in shanty towns, the masses are going to go, yeah, I'm happy with this. They're already getting pissed off now and the problem hasn't even really started. So it's not going to work. Because people ultimately, you break them completely. They're not going to take it. They'll take it now because most people on furlough go, well, I'm just sat at home. I'm having I don't like being stuck home, but hey, I'm not having to go to work every day. Life's not too bad. Why am I going to complain about it? Tell them tomorrow, oh, sorry, you've got no furlough money. Your job's gone. I'm giving you, a fraction of the money each week. Oh, I don't care whether you can't pay your mortgage or your rent. Well, if you end up homeless, that's your problem. There's going to be a flip in their head where there's somebody going to go, no, I'm not going to tolerate this. And that's just reality. And that's why they would never put themselves in that position. And that's partly why in 2008, when the right decision was to allow some banks to collapse, and they could have reinflated everything, not had QE, zero interest rate policy, and they could have not had everything collapse in the way it is now. Part of the reason they didn't do it is because they feared enormous societal collapse because of banks collapsing. That was genuinely one of their fears because they can't control. They control people by keeping them in a system that keeps people passive, keeps people going, okay, it's not great. Yeah, I'll grumble about the government, but I'm tolerant to this. As soon as you take them outside that, all bets are off, all parameters out the window. And 60-odd million people, you are not going to know what's going to happen. The one thing you're going to have is an enormous mental health crisis. The risk is we'll have one anyway, given what's coming. But you're going to have an utter societal meltdown. You'd end up with a situation where we had a shanty town. You'd have enormous gangs controlling cities. They would control London. And no police, no one anywhere the police wouldn't get anywhere near. Authority wouldn't control anything. They're not going to allow that to happen, because when that happens, and you add in with the Mad Max scenario, they're not going to control anything. Absolutely nothing. What do you mean? Ask him if he pays his gas bill.
It's a bit of an inside joke here.
Okay.
There's no, it's not to do with you at all.
But you know,
but
I'm trying to be objective because I'm trying to save people a whole bunch of unnecessary fear that something's going to happen, which is just not sustainable.
But well, I mean,
So,
it's already done. It's already done. So.
Well, no, it's not. But no, but the real effects have hardly happened for most people.
Yeah, but
I mean,
the effects, if it's done, the effects are going to be coming along, aren't they?
Well, yes, but what I mean is, there's one. Look, here's the thing. It's one thing getting up tomorrow, going, well, I've still got my job, and then a week later you don't have your job and you're destitute. You can't. We haven't reached the point where we flipped into the next part of people's experience and how this pandemic's affecting them. Huge amount. But eventually it's going to affect tens of millions of people in extremely adverse ways. We haven't quite reached that point yet, but when we reach that point, then the whole thing blows up, and then all bets are off. I mean, do you really think you could map out a solution to control 60 odd million people and understand the outcome? Do you think that's realistic?
Well, no, I don't. I don't think that's very realistic. But I just don't think I think they don't think that we're going to do that, no matter what, no matter how far.
But that's the point. They're not going to take the risk that we'll just not do anything. They're not going to go, well, I know, let's take a calculated risk that they'll just be all passive about this. And here's the other thing: when everyone's got nothing, there won't be any investment banking, there won't be any stock market, there won't be anything. So you're decapitating the income that the banking system makes. You're decapitating the corporations who won't have us buying any of their goods. So you're immediately destroying the fractions of 1% that everyone thinks is benefiting from this. Without us, they don't have anything. I mean, do we think that the fractions of 1% at the top don't depend on us at all in any way, shape, or form? Of course they do. They have to. They need billions of people around the world buying into their system, buying their goods, buying their services. I mean, here's a great example, just a small example. If everyone's destitute, no one's going to have a mobile phone anymore. So all the mobile phone operators will go bust. So they've gone straight off. Right. Here's the other thing. All the big media companies, no one's got any money. No one's going to pay the subscription. So they all go bust. Right. Should we just keep going with this? Because this is what I'm saying.
I mean, you can, but I mean, it doesn't have to be like that. I mean, I was giving it a scenario, a worst case scenario what I'm talking about is that the damage is now done. So how do we get ourselves out of this?
Right. Okay. That's a great question.
Go on.
Okay. Here's what happens. Right. Yes, we've reached the point in time where everything's going to blow up. This was going to happen anyway. But okay. So what happens is everything blows up. The situation then is it's not going to be from an aggressive standpoint that goes, well, this is all part of the plan. They're going to have to, and this is where the real problem lies. We're going to have to find a way. It's rather like the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Russia's recovered. Okay, we're not going to get into a discussion about what Russia's really like because that's a can of worms I don't even want to begin to open. But anyway, Russia's recovered. It's actually got a pretty strong economy now. Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's taken 20 years to get where it is, and it's still got another 10 years to go. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at a long-term rebuilding program. That means we're going to have to start from scratch. We're going to have to rebuild. Society is going to have to go through this huge transformation, and it's not going to be pretty, and it's going to be painful, and it's going to be challenging and difficult. Well, someone's gone, just sorry to attract my attention, big corporations are being merged. What difference does that make? So we still have a big corporation. You put them together, they depend on us buying things. If we don't buy things, a merged corporation will go bust. They need millions and billions of people. I mean, look, here's the thing, right? Look at oil companies. Oil companies are not going to survive if the world's economy grinds to a halt, because no one's going to buy the oil. We're not going to be driving cars. The car industry all goes bust. No one's buying any diesel or petrol. All the economies of the world collapse. So we live in this serfdom, as people think. All those corporations go bust. I could list 100 corporations now that will go bust immediately under this model that people think is going to happen. So, but the corporations are what people believe to be the deep state. So the corporations are going to decapitate themselves to control us. No, they already control us, and they're starting to struggle anyway, but they've had a pretty good run for a long time, controlling us as much as they need to. They don't need to decapitate us and put us in shanty towns, because there's no benefit to them. It's a cost benefit ratio to that. They want to benefit as much as they can, and they're not going to slit their own throat by putting us in shanty towns, because that destroys their empire. They're not going to sell anything anymore to anyone. It's like people say, yeah, all small shops will disappear, and it's all being concentrated into Amazon, for argument's sake. Okay, let's look at that. Okay, there's some validity in that. But when everyone's living in a shanty town, they're hardly going to be. They're not going to have the phone or the internet connection to go online to buy goods they don't have any money to buy. So Amazon goes bust as well. The whole idea of like serfs and masters and lords worked a few hundred years ago. It doesn't work now. The system can't function that way. Yeah, you could have this because we didn't have a capitalist society. We didn't have big corporations when they ran this system a long time ago. So it functioned. But you know why it failed? Because you can't sustain people in that system. The system eventually, okay, it took a long time, it evolved into what it is, and now it's collapsing again in the West. But that's the point. You can't function in a society where we're all serfs again, because the whole dynamic of the world's completely different. I mean, you're talking about just bankrupting everything. So even the masters will be serfs because they'll have no control over anyone. And when there's 67 million people in the UK, and there's a few of them, and then mob rule takes over, which is the last thing we want. But that's what we'd end up with. Because what do you think then when they can't pay the police? The police can't be paid because there's no money to pay them. They're all going to be starving and destitute. You think they're going to fight with the government or a few people in control? They're going to just drop off and go, no, we're not defending this system anymore. It's failed. You're talking about, that's what I mean when you think about the logic of this. It doesn't work out. It's impossible. But you know what the greatest thing is? We're talking about heightened states of emotion. People are driven into fear that this is what's happening. It's all part of a plan. And people just believe it's reality. Well, it's not reality. I mean, and the point is, we're going through this transient phase where everything's collapsing. We're witnessing a once in maybe, well, in the Western sense, once in a few hundred years. This is a unique event. This is the end of one civilization, so to speak, controlling or trying to control global events, and it's over. And there's no, this is ending. And the other empire has been rising for decades. It's Southeast Asia. It's China. And that empire is building outwards. It's building north-south. It's building west and east. It's now it's got a lot of influence in Middle East, across even Europe, in Africa, in South America, in Central America, and so on and so on. It's building out all over the world. This is the future. The problem is everyone in the West's going, no, we're the future. And everyone in the world's going, you haven't realized what's going on. You're not the future anymore. You're going to have to join the new future. But people in the West can't grasp that. They think we're dominant. We're always going to be dominant. So when we collapse, it's deliberate, because otherwise I can't comprehend that this empire is no longer in control. So the natural reaction is, well, and the alt media has done a great job in making people believe this is how the world operates. And it doesn't operate. It absolutely doesn't operate. I'll tell you one thing that may surprise people. The amount of global cooperation that has to go on every single day on this planet to make sure we all go to bed at night and wake up in the morning so the world's more or less in the same shape is staggering. And that alone demonstrates the world doesn't operate. The world doesn't operate how the alt media thinks the world operates. That's just another cue. It's another, instead of the euphoric thing, it's let's sell you this dystopian view. We know in history horrendous things have happened. No one's disputing that. No one's doubting these things have happened. But this has been distorted. And why? Because it drives people into a heightened state of fear. And then they've got a captive audience. People keep wanting to hear, even though they're frightened. Well, what's the plan? What are they going to do next? As I say, the pandemic was manna from heaven. The second the pandemic struck, I sat there going, oh my goodness, I know what's coming. The sections of the alt media are going to hammer this. They're going to milk this for every last dime they can get out of it, or every last drop of something, because that's what happens. And when this pandemic goes away, and things evolve and change, and then in a few years, people will look back and go, well, actually, that didn't happen. But you know, the worst thing is that something may happen in the future, and they'll latch on to the next thing. I mean, how many times? Look, in the last 25 years, I've known numerous occasions where I've been told there's a dystopian plan to collapse everything. They're going to collapse everything. Do you know what? In 2008, there was mutterings. Oh, look, they've collapsed something. It's deliberate. Oh, hang on, they've saved the system. And this is just this cyclical thing. So that, and unfortunately, this is not what is playing out in reality. Do we? I mean, here's an example. As much as people, I mean, I despise governments. I've never voted in my life. I don't believe in them. The entire political system is an illusion. It's a gigantic lie. So we all sit there arguing with each other. The Labour's better than the Conservatives, and the Conservatives are better than Labour. The whole thing's illusion. But the idea we're sat there that there's politicians sat there in Parliament who are going, I'm party to the biggest illusion that's ever been foisted on humanity. I know there's this illusion, and they're going to sit there and go, I'm going to be part of that. No, absolutely not. Whatever we think of these people, they're not going to put themselves in that position. Because all it needs is at some point that lie is going to be found out. That gigantic lie is not. You can't contain billions of people in the world all interacting with this lie, and somehow no one's actually come out with the smoking gun that goes, this is a lie. This is what's actually been going on. That's
a smoking gun and said this is true. This is what have you. This is it. This virus. This is why we've done this.
The virus is real. There's numerous peer papers that prove it's real.
Rumors, and that's all you ever hear is rumors.
Well, that's the problem. But
podcast is rumors. That's all you see on alt media is rumors. All I'm saying is
yes, and that's the problem.
It's on the media as well, on the mainstream media.
Well, yes, and there's fear campaign in the mainstream media, no doubt about it.
And so God, my nose. Anyway, Paul, it's been interesting. I'll say that.
Well,
no,
yeah, but
no,
yeah,
no,
I mean,
go
I
on.
mean, I said to you before, a lot of people aren't going to like what I say, and but I'm not. I don't mind. That's not the point. I'm just saying that how the world operates, how the world actually functions, is completely divorced from what how much of the alt media would like people to believe the world functions. And I don't doubt lots of people in the alt media genuinely believe this to be true. I don't dispute that, and I think they're totally sincere about this. But just because they believe something and sincerely doesn't make it reality. And that's the problem is if you keep cultivating the idea of fear in people, it's very rather like the euphoria. It's very hard for people to not be sucked into fear. And the other thing is, you've got to bear in mind, if people go back 4 years ago and listen to when we did things way back, I've not shifted an inch in anything I've ever said in 4 years. Because everything, the way, less the virus because we didn't know it, but I explained everything that was going to happen now was happening. Well, is that just a big coincidence? Well, no, the virus is just an accelerant of that process. And in many ways, it's had a massive impact on people. But it hasn't switched my focus from the fundamental problems that were always going to happen. But yeah, I mean, this has affected everybody's lives to varying degrees, no doubt about it. And I completely deplore the government policy in every way, shape, or form. Absolutely 100%. I don't agree with it. But there's a big difference to go from disagreeing with all that to going, they're doing it deliberately. That's like a seismic shift. But people are going from, I don't trust the government, they must be doing this, and then they just immediately jump to this must be deliberate. And I'm trying to say, okay, explain to me why. And I haven't really had anyone convince me why they would do this when we just explained precisely why it would destroy everything. So it would destroy the corporations, the financial system. So why would they do the very thing that's going to blow up their empire? Why would they do that?
Who knows?
Why did they save it in 2008 when they could have collapsed it there? That's the question.
Who knows? Perhaps some pieces needed moving. Listen, I need to finish.
Yeah.
Over by nearly half an hour, so people have had the money's worth tonight.
Or maybe they just died of boredom. I don't know.
It's been interesting in the chat room. Not everybody is agreeing with you.
No, I don't mind. Well, it's not the point.
But, that's the point is to look at whatever someone else is thinking to yours. And whilst I do see your point on a lot of things, I do see a lot of holes and a lot of things that we could talk about another time.
Yes, okay, that's fine. If there's things, no, that's fine. That's the whole point. If there's things, you feel that there's holes in it, let's explore what the holes are. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, my dog needs a waz. So,
right. Well,
we're gonna have to go. Thanks very much for joining me, mate. It's
a pleasure. Yeah. Look after yourselves, and obviously, we'll reconvene on the holes in the argument.
Whoa, your website? You got a website?
Oh yes, it's the siriusreport.com. To be honest, we don't have a huge amount of time to update it with articles because we do. Not that I'm not trying to sell in. We do a subscription podcast service, which because we tried to put everything out for free and we were immediately demonetized on every platform, and that was 4.5 years ago. So everyone complains now about being demonetized. Well, we were demonetized in 20 minutes on YouTube. So anyway, we had, and I'm not trying to sell people to subscribe. That's not the point, but we've done nearly 1,100 podcasts on that, and I do some other stuff on another platform, but that's all paywalled because unfortunately we couldn't put anything out for free. So I would gladly like to put stuff out for free, but if you get demonetized, you don't earn any income from it. So.
Yep, and that's the whole point in it. Anyway, you're. I'm glad it's. I hope everything's going well, and if so, then I'm glad of that. And say hello to Rita for us.
I will do.
And thanks for coming on. We'll speak again very soon.
Yes, it's a pleasure.
That was it. That's it tonight. It was me, Jason, here on Raconteurs News with Paul from the Sirius Report. I'll be back on Friday night for an After Dark about 9:30. And join me. It'll be there'll be drinks, little drinks and little bits of like stuff with stuff on, like little like biscuits with stuff on. So anyway, see you.